Welcome to the Uncharted podcast. I am your host, Inés Franklin. My hope for you today is that we discover faith beyond the boundaries. Uncharted is intended to be a safe place for you to listen, learn, and challenge yourself along your journey of faith. May grace and peace be with you today. Welcome to the show. Okay, Kayleigh, we're talking about controlling the tongue, and I'm already thinking maybe I should stay quiet the whole time.
You're like, but what is this? I know we both looked at, okay, so the first one today we're recording is control of the tongue, and we made a face at each other.
Yes. Not our spiritual gift. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Embarrassing to say.
Folks, welcome back.
Yeah.
Welcome back. This is real. We're talking about spiritual practices. I'm Inés Franklin. So good that you've joined us today as we've been looking at all the spiritual practices. Here's what we've learned. Some of them are really fun and we're all in and we feel good at them. Some of them, like today, they're a challenge.
Yeah.
Do
we have to, God? Like, do we have to,
Yeah.
But it's good for us. It's good for us. So let's do what we always do, which is we go through these definitions and the desire that is in Adele Cahoon's book. She gives so much great information. And I think she just really kind of paves the way for this conversation. And so the definition that she has in her book is control of the tongue involves an intentional awareness and governance of words as well as tone of voice in all communication. Yeah. I know. It's the tone. You know what I mean? Because like you can control your words and think that you've got it like down pat. But if you're saying gentle words with like an intensity or a sarcasm or whatever, you're still not controlling your tongue.
That's right. I was thinking we are talking about spiritual practices and we have defined spiritual practices is things that we do that draw us closer to God, things that we do that open up space for God to do a work in our hearts, for us to feel his presence, for him to start to change us. To me, is thinking about this one in the context of spiritual practices that draw us closer to God, kind of takes a slightly different, to me, it takes a different turn, right?
Yeah.
So here's how I think. I know that with my words, I can either build or tear down. And like you say, with my tone of voice, I can say the same thing in my tone of voice difference. Well, even though I'm saying something that's going to be building, my tone of voice can be destroying at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I think to be mindful of our tongue is to be mindful of our charter from God, to join him in the act of creation, in the act of multiplying, the act of bringing grace and reconciliation and grace and love and mercy into the world. That's how I look at it as a spiritual practices.
Yeah. And I think that is a lot of what Adele Cahoon says too. It's like the God-given fruit of this practice, so how we grow closer to him, is that we are uplifting others, which is what we're called to do, right? Like at the end of the day, that's what we're called to do, is love well and care for others well. And so we're doing that when we are watching our tongue and watching our words and watching how we speak. Yeah. But what I also thought that was really well said that she said was keeping company with Jesus in all your speech. So like that really does give clarity to like how we do this with God, like how our speech with others then still builds up our relationship with God. And it's because it allows us to remain in close contact with God in all ways, in all communication, in all conversations.
That's so good. In fact, that brings up a story. Years ago, Jim was injured. Remember when he got injured on the ATV accident? Mm-hmm. And he was home for a couple of months recovering. He couldn't drive when he came out of the injury. He really destroyed one of his foot. Thank goodness he can walk. He's doing great. But anyway, I was taking care of him downstairs. And then it was time for him to start going back to work. He needed a driver. because it was the foot that he needed for driving.
Yeah.
And a driver would come and pick him up. And one morning, I was all twisted backwards in my head. He did something that really upset me. So I started to give him some smack. And there I was not controlling my tongue. I was very Puerto Rican, going at it. Woo, 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 woo. And how dare you? I've been working so hard, blah, blah, blah. I just had this whole pity party thing. And then I felt like there was someone behind me. And I paused and I looked behind, and there was the driver holding his beanie like this, kind of like, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm here to pick up Jim. So I turned around to Jim. I gave him a kiss and I said, have a great day, honey. And then
it was fine. Everything's fine. We were not just, I was not doing that.
This is how we talk. So he left. He left, and I'm so embarrassed. I'm thinking, oh dear, that was embarrassing. That guy heard me, yelling at my husband. He probably doesn't understand. I don't do this all the time, blah, blah, blah. I'm having these thoughts and I'm putting on my makeup. And it's like, so embarrassing that he heard me. I think I was ruminating on that a lot. And I sensed the Holy Spirit, Lord, very kindly but firmly saying, hey, I see all the time. It's like, you're worried about what other people think, but I see all the time. And I realized, yes, you're right, Lord. I shouldn't unleash my mouth. I should control my tongue to my husband, whether someone is watching or not. So that's an example of where I kind of drew closer to God when I did not control my tongue. And God kind of rebuked me, but very gently and kindly and firmly.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great story. And that's a great way of just a reminder and probably something that like now forever reminds you like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. Yeah. That was a bummer, but I do think too, the controlling our tongue, like the act of actually controlling our tongue also is something that can help us grow closer to God in that moment because we can actually seek God's guidance to do so. Right. I think God is so good at just being like, okay, he's there for you in those little moments. And so if you can slow down enough to like truly seek God before opening your mouth, that too will help, like for sure. I know there's definitely been moments where my daughter and I are like the same. Okay. And controlling our tongue is definitely part of our problem. Like it's a journey with each other. Like we just go, she's 7. You guys, this is like embarrassing that I fight with my 7-year-old like this. Okay. So I am also just like owning it's a reality. I'm not proud of myself. I'm like, why am I fighting with you? But we go head to head and it's like a full thing and we'll just get really frustrated with each other. And part of it is because my daughter is like very, what is the word for it? Like she is, but it's also like a perfectionism, not in a bad way. Like I think it's such a beautiful gift, but she just really like, if you say the wrong word, she wants to like very much clarify that is not the word that she thinks you should be using or not the way you should be saying it. And she'll like very much correct you. Like, no, that mom, you said that wrong. And it like gets on my very last nerve. Like, holy cow, kid, just stop. You know what I'm trying to say. Just let it go. Like move on. But what's so beautiful is like, it also has been a practice in myself of like, oh, I do that. Like, I know she learned this because like I am that way. And I will be like, that's not the right word. That's not what you meant. That's not what you're trying to say. And she's like, oh, mom, And so it's like a really good thing that sometimes when she like corrects me, instead of my desire to snap back, I will be like, okay, God, help me see it through her eyes, help me understand what she's trying to show me, and okay, help me do this a different way. And then when that happens, I can like stop and just appreciate my kid being very aware of like everything around her and how things are coming out and how things are being seen, which is like really cool, But yeah, a lot of times I respond not that way. So, ownership and poor decisions.
True. I have to say, spiritual practices, when we create a void of something, like for example, when we did fasting, we talked about saying no to ourselves so we can say yes to God. And every time we got hungry, that was like an alarm clock to go spend some time with the Lord, go listen to worship music or pray or read the Bible, etc. Well, the tongue is like the best alarm clock of all, really, because we're using it all the time. And there's a pretty good chance that we're going to say something, whether it's gossip or like, a snappy statement or just down and out tearing words or something that's just demeaning. If we're self-aware, those become alarm clocks to go, whoa, I need some time with the Lord. So for example, I when I was 9, we lived in the South Bronx for a year and a half, and I didn't know English. So here I was learning English from the kids in the street.
Oh,
So I
no.
learned all the juicy words. Those are the first words I learned, all of them. And I used them a lot. In the South Bronx, like every other word was a word. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I used them all. I
Was a
used them for
4-letter
everything.
word.
It was just words, man. It was like I could say that word and I could put some emotion behind it, and I would say it all the time. Well, I'm an adult now, and I don't want to use those words. And I don't use them in my everyday language. However, if something goes wrong, this morning I spilled my coffee all over myself. I had just made like the perfect cup of coffee with my protein powder and cinnamon and honey. It was beautiful. I even had the frothy thing at the top, and I went to drink it and I spilled the whole thing on me. The whole thing.
No.
Well, then, of course, what comes out of my mouth?
All those really great
Bleep,
words we learned at
bleep,
9.
bleep, 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 bleep. And there was nobody watching. So technically speaking, big deal. But a long time ago, I decided I don't want this word to come out at the wrong time in the wrong place in front of the wrong people. So I want these words to be out of my brain. I want them gone, And so every time I say a word like that, I say the Lord's Prayer. I just connected those two things together. I say that word, now I go to the Lord's Prayer. And so it becomes an alarm clock. And not that I want to avoid saying the Lord's Prayer. Don't get me wrong. I want to avoid saying the words, but most importantly, I want to switch my heart from releasing my emotion through a negative word or through a negative statement to releasing my emotion in prayer to God. That's really what I'm practicing there, is to say, God, I'm going to give you this emotion through a time of prayer. I don't want to think about what the prayer is, so I'm going to do the Lord's Prayer because I know that one by heart. And in that process of praying, I connect with the Lord and my emotions change.
Yeah,
So that's how I've been trying. Yeah.
And I was thinking about how, in that same realm, how much this spiritual practice, the spiritual practice of controlling the tongue, requires a bit of intentionality. I feel like all spiritual practices do to a point. Fasting for the purpose, for example, requires you to intentionally choose to fast and choose to give up these things and repetitively tell yourself, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to focus on my relationship with God. Or when we talked about prayer walks, right? Or those kind of things that requires the intentionality of time. So all of them require a sense of intentionality, but this one feels like it requires intentionality in a moment that also is heightened. It really requires a stop, a quick stop, because a lot of times we don't control our tongues when we are also heavily emotional or uncomfortable or frustrated, right? Whenever there's a heightened emotion, that's when controlling the tongue becomes more challenging. And so it's a really unique spiritual practice that it requires not just in the down times to control the tongue, but in the moments where, I am now pressured to actually also do this spiritual practice and control my tongue and stop and not just react out of my first nature of whatever it is that I'd want to say or do in that moment.
Very good. Yes, that impulse, right?
Yes.
And so, I had to make a plan and decision knowing I'm going to stub my toe. I'm going to spill something. Something's going to go wrong. Someone's going to cut me off. That's going to happen. Life is going to bring those kind of circumstances. What's my plan when those things come? The other thing I'm learning too is microaggression. So with my tongue and my tone of voice, I can do some microaggression things. My goodness, Kayleigh, you've experienced that from me, where I'll say something and I think I'm meaning it one way, but my heart is so clear in a different place. You're like, oh, that stung. I felt that.
Yeah. Yeah. We all do it, I think.
Yeah, there's like this little microaggression or
Yeah.
an intent behind the statement that is, I'm asking a question, but I'm really making an accusation, or I'm reprimanding even though it sounds like I'm being curious. I mean, there's so many ways in which we can do microaggression with our words, which is why James says the tongue can start fires, forest
Mhm.
fires. Like a little statement can just like create this big old mess.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, controlling the tongue is so important, but yet so hard.
And life and death is in the power of the tongue, right? Like that is
Yes.
also so true. And I feel like I really try to like own that really well is like, okay, I can either speak life or I can literally speak death. Like I can make this
Yeah.
situation worse or I can make it better. So when I am calm, when I am not in an emotional state, when I am not dealing with something, I try to remind myself. And I've taught my daughter that too. Like speaking of that daughter of mine, who is just she's the best. She truly is. But she was being hypercritical with me like over summer break about something. And I said, "Hey, Rye, like life and death is in the power of the tongue." And so when you are being hypercritical like that, you are literally speaking death over me or over the person that you're hypercriticizing. And so I don't
Whoa.
think you realize that, but like I don't think that you would want us to speak like that over you. Like I don't think you'd want us just
Mm.
to point out every single thing that you did wrong or how you did it. I don't think you'd want us to continually like remind you. You would want us to talk to you about it and then move on. Please have the same honor and respect to us that you're seeking. And she was like, oh my gosh. And like it shifted for her so quickly. She
Wow.
realized, like that's a really real statement. Like, okay, I don't want to do that. I don't want to speak death over people.
Right. And how Ryan, I think when you cast vision for someone, this is another way of giving life with our
Yeah.
words, is sometimes reflecting back to someone, because a lot of times people can't see. Like even Adele shares how controlling the tongue isn't about just being quiet, but it's also using our words to reflect truth to someone in a kind and gentle manner. So I
Yeah.
think in a way you were showing her something that she couldn't see, especially she's 7, but really you can have the same conversation. You've had those conversations with me, like, Mom, the way you said that, that hurt.
Yeah.
Jim has done that
People
with
have
me
had those
too.
conversations with me, you know what I mean? So it's all part of
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
truly is the journey of I think all of us. Like I think it's
Yes.
life. And I have found that there are people in my life that I've lost friendships with because they uh struggled with this aspect to the point that I
Mm.
had a hard time connecting, not because I want to be told lies or not called out if I'm doing something wrong, but when someone does it in a way that doesn't leave room for us to truly edify God or to edify Jesus or to like work through and find a connection point, then what does that look like? The desire in this book, in Adele Cahoon's book, I think is so great. And so I didn't say it earlier, but it says to turn the destructive way I use words into authentic, loving, and healing speech. So kind of like what you were
Yeah.
just saying, it's truly it is not speaking death, but it is truly also speaking life. It's communicating it in a way, even when the topic is hard, or even when something is not like rainbows and butterflies, to have the hard conversations in a way that is loving and affirming and uplifting and healing to the other person that you're having that conversation with.
So true. Folks, if you're new to this podcast or to our YouTube channel, know that we've been working through lots of spiritual practices using Adele Calhoun's book, which is all about spiritual practices. And we will put the book information on the show notes. But you could also subscribe to the channel so you get all these as we produce them. And also, you can go to InesFranklin.com and you'll see the podcast feed there. So you can see all the different practices. And we always try to connect it to what Adele is talking about, because this is kind of like the book we're using to discuss these spiritual practices. And don't forget to subscribe to our email list, because we also send these by email and you won't miss them. So you can
Yeah.
Spotify, YouTube, Apple, on the website, by email. We want to sure you don't miss any of them. And yes, we recommend the book as well. So, okay, yes. Speaking of which, I was thinking about worship. Remember, we had that whole
Mm-hmm.
podcast on worship. This is what made me think about letting everybody know, go check the other ones out. because worship is us really controlling our tongue. When you think about it, we are, when we're singing, when we're speaking, when we're praising God, we are choosing to use our words and our heart words in a way to speak truth over ourselves about who God is. And so you and I talked about this early on, how all of these things connect to one another. All these spiritual practices connect. Prayer isn't all of them. Really, I just talked about prayer as my way of getting rid of bad words. But worship is another way. So when we practice worship and speaking the good things about God, for example, if we're worshiping by praise, worshiping by singing, we can, it says in scripture, sing songs and hymns over each other. Like speak to one another in songs and hymns. Paul says that. I have to remember what that is. I think it's Colossians. Whereas this is posture to one another to speak words of truth. And that's another way of growing closer to God and at the same time controlling the tongue, controlling that tendency of negativity and hypercriticism and negative feedback, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so important to recognize. We always talk about this, but I think it's just one of my favorite things is how interconnected these are. In
Yeah.
fact, you will have to come back in 2 weeks because our next podcast episode also is going to so much align with controlling the
Yeah.
tongue. So you're definitely going to have to come back and check it out because I do think just so many, especially recently, so many of them are interconnected. Like last time was humility, which also then
Yeah.
comes into controlling the tongue. If we're living humble lives, if we're practicing the spiritual practice of humility, we are also controlling our tongue. We are also stopping, pausing, and thinking through what we're doing because we're recognizing we are not the end all be all here, right? But that we
Yeah.
just have a space to speak into someone's life who we love.
Very true. I think as we get through many of these spiritual practices, we're going to go through this all the way through the end of the year. It's not intended to overwhelm us with, oh my goodness, there's so many spiritual practices. How do I keep track of all of these? How do I do them all? What they really show is that every aspect of our lives, every part of the way we live, is interconnected with our relationship with God. So, humility is a heart posture, right? And worship is a heart posture. Generosity is a heart posture. Controlling our tongue is a heart posture. All of these things, we can bounce around the various different practices, but they're all doing the same thing. They're constantly changing our hearts, transforming our hearts. So I say this in case you've been listening to these for a while and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm getting overwhelmed. I don't know which one to do. The reality is you're going to be practicing all of them at all the time, not all the time, not all consciously, but if you're thinking of them and know them, you'll notice you do them more often than not, I would say. Have you noticed that,
Yeah.
Kayleigh?
Oh, yeah, totally. And I do think it's also a lot of these may not even, it's not that they are not spiritual practices. They all are spiritual practices. It's all very clear when we discuss it. But I think if you just heard controlling the tongue, your first reaction is not, oh, yeah, okay, that's a practice that's going to get me closer to God, right? And so I think that that's the cool thing about doing these is we are also learning, oh, these are all everyday actions or things that I'm already practicing or things that I would love to be doing that are going to help me grow closer to God while also helping me grow as a light in this world, as a Christ follower in this world. I think this is our temporary home. It's where we get to be for a little while. And it's cool to see while we're here on this temporary home that the things that get us closer to God are also things that get us closer to those around us and show how to love those around us and show how to truly be as Jesus is to those around us.
So true. That's a good place to end for this podcast, folks. Remember, if you have not subscribed, make sure you do here on the channel or on our website. And, I want to ask you to share this with your friends because here's what I'm thinking. When I shared with you just now these things that I have done myself when I don't control my tongue, I have a sense of accountability, right? Like I've just shared this with you and it makes me feel like, okay, this is important to me and I'm opening myself up to be held accountable. So to me, this podcast is a good one. Like I'm going to share with some people to say, hold me accountable that I use my words to bring life and not to destroy. So that's one way to share this. Share it with friends who might be encouraged by this. Have a good conversation. This is part of what we want to do. We want to start these conversations and hope that they bless you and help you grow closer to God. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you on the next one. And may the peace and grace of Jesus Christ be with you.
God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Uncharted Podcast with Inés Franklin. Learn more about Inés at unchartedpod.com. Follow Inés' journey on Instagram at Inés Franklin. Sign up for our email list to receive direct access to online experiences and more. Thanks for listening, and join us again next time.